Oxford in February is a study in paleness. Not purity, mind you. That would be far too generous. But a sort of institutionalized grey, the kind that settles on slate roofs and academic gowns, on the shoulders of old men and older statues. Even the sky seems to withdraw, as though ashamed to witness the business below. I was nursing a mild ache in my left knee, the result, I think, of a misstep on black ice outside the Ashmolean 2 weeks prior. Or perhaps the injury was older. One of those unnamed discomforts that quietly migrate from limb to limb as the years assert themselves. Either way, I had resigned myself to a day of indoor warmth and tentative crosswording. A glass of claret rested beside the record player, and Schubert's Andante con moto had just begun to loop when the obituary found me. Distinguished ethicist Dr. Felix Arden Dies, suddenly at Oxford College. There was no photograph, no flurry of adjectives, just that neutral, indifferent syntax, a line break's worth of legacy. Arden had been known in some circles, though never truly loved, I think, not even by his admirers. There was an aridness about his public morality that never quite reconciled itself with the warmth of human fallibility. Still, the wording was curious. Suddenly. Not tragically. Not unexpectedly. Just suddenly, as though his disappearance were a small oversight in the bookkeeping of life. The bell of St. Simeon's had rung earlier that morning. A single, patient toll. I'd assumed it was marking some minor ecclesiastical event. Only now did I recall the way it had seemed to linger, unnaturally long, against the walls of Radcliffe Square. The echo had arrived late, like a guest unsure whether he was invited. St. Simeon's itself is a pocket of forgotten theology, tucked between two livelier colleges as though hiding its ancient convictions behind their laughter. The place has always struck me as too neat, too ascetic. There's something oppressive about enforced order. I recall once stepping inside their chapel during evensong. The silence had felt more imposed than embraced. I left the clipping on the edge of the desk and turned back to the crossword, half finished and wholly disinterested. One clue held me. To appear, but never arrive, 6. I wrote nothing. The pen hovered, trembled slightly, and fell still. Something in the back of my mind itched. Arden had published a paper, a year or two ago, that had stirred mild academic tremors. The Unburdened Conscience, it was called. A meditation on whether silence could, under certain conditions, be considered a higher moral action than truth. It was the kind of abstract premise that earned one standing ovations in theology seminars and death threats from undergraduates with fathers in Parliament. And now he was dead. I suppose what troubled me was not the fact of it. Death comes for ethicists just as readily as for the rest of us. But the tone in which it was announced, the absence of reaction, the lack of mourning, even in the margins of the Times, a man's passing is usually felt, however faintly. But this was clinical. I poured myself another half-glass and stood, limping slightly to the window. Below, the quad was slick with meltwater. A student darted across it, coat flapping like the wings of a nervous bird. No one paused beneath the bell tower. No one looked up. There was something else, a memory, or maybe only a shadow of one. Arden had once visited my lecture, uninvited, unannounced. I had been speaking on Donne, as I often did, and when I quoted, "Never send to know for whom the bell tolls," I'd seen him stiffen, not out of boredom, but recognition, as though the bell in the poem were not metaphor, but warning. I didn't like him, that should be said plainly, but I respected the precision of his mind, the elegance of his cruelty, a man who carved his arguments with surgical detachment, always ready to remove a conscience if it interfered with the thesis. Schubert ended. The record skipped once, caught its breath, and fell into silence. Outside, the sky had begun to dim, a sallow, stubborn twilight. Somewhere behind the rooftops, the bell tower of St. Simeon's stood still. I found my coat, my keys, and the strength to ignore the ache in my knee. If nothing else, I thought, Arden had deserved a better conclusion than suddenly. There is a kind of hush particular to old institutions, not the gentle silence of libraries or the reverent quiet of churches, but something denser, colder, a silence that feels earned. St. Simeon's wore its hush like a second mortar coat, thickened over centuries. Even the ivy grew with deliberation here. Lewis and I arrived mid-morning. The porter, a dull man with the gait of someone forever just recovering from the flu, led us through 2 cloisters and an unnecessarily winding staircase to the warden's office. The place smelled of pipe ash, worn tweed, and something faintly antiseptic. Dr. Calloway received us with the cordial briskness of a man who believes in conclusions but not questions. He was tall, almost elegantly so, though the shape of his ears gave him away as someone more peasant than patrician. His spectacles sat low on his nose, not quite in use, not quite decorative. He offered us coffee, which I declined, and began before Lewis had even opened his notebook. Dr. Arden's death was, in every available sense, natural. No signs of struggle, no disturbance, no blood. The physician recorded a cardiac episode. It's not uncommon in men of his age, especially with his history. I asked, what history? Calloway adjusted his glasses in a way that suggested he wished he hadn't mentioned it. Felix had, there had been an incident last year. Fainting during a debate. Exhaustion, supposedly, but he refused further investigation. Refused, not declined. A subtle difference, but one I've come to respect. I asked about the scene. East Hall Common Room. Sometime after midnight. A fellow, Dr. Hale, found him when he came down to return a book. Felix was alone. The teacup had shattered on the hearthstone. He was... Calloway hesitated, looking at his desk. Reaching for something, it seemed. Hand outstretched. It looked operatic. He didn't mean the word kindly. Lewis and I walked the scene shortly after. East Hall was colder than the rest of the building, colder than it had any right to be, even with the radiators off. The common room was a high-ceilinged space, all varnished oak and narrow mullioned windows. The hearth was bare. No fire, no tea service either, save for a cracked china saucer and the scatter of ceramic fragments beneath a nearby armchair. Felix Arden's last posture had been described accurately. His hand had reached out, as though inviting something back, or pushing it away. A loose cushion bore a faint indentation, not recent, possibly nothing, possibly not. Lewis hovered near the windows. It's odd, sir. No one heard anything? According to Calloway, no. The building is old stone, thick walls, no screams, no thuds, no broken furniture, no echoes. I was about to agree when a voice arrived behind me. Tentative, clear and young. I heard something. She was slight, maybe 19, with hair the color of dried leaves and an expression that had learned too early not to expect welcome. Her gown was ill-fitting, and she held a book too tightly under her arm. I asked her name. Imogen Vale. First year. Theology. I live on the floor above the common room. I watched her face as she spoke, not the words, but the silence between them. It was late, she said. Just past 1, I think. I was reading something I shouldn't have been. A horror novel, not a gospel. And then I heard it. A scream. Not loud, but... She trailed off. I didn't press. I asked if she told anyone. She had. A porter. He checked the hall, found nothing, no body, no movement. Just the room. Empty. The scream had come and gone. Lewis frowned beside me. It didn't make sense. If Arden had died then, he should have been found then. If he hadn't, what had she heard? Imogen looked at me, then. For the first time, really looked. Sometimes buildings remember things. Maybe they echo not what just happened, but something that's about to. I nodded. Not because I believed her, but because she had phrased it beautifully. We left soon after. The porter locked the door behind us with 2 quick turns and a cough. Back outside, Lewis asked what I made of it. I said nothing, but I was already thinking of that outstretched hand, of a scream no one else had heard, and of how some silences come not from absence, but refusal. I've never trusted people who describe the dead as brilliant. It is a word without teeth, used when clarity is inconvenient and truth has been filed down to something smooth and ceremonial. So when the academic staff of St. Simeon's began to offer their tributes to Felix Arden, each glistening with exactly the same degree of admiration, I began quietly to take notes. Not of what they said, but of how precisely they didn't say more. Dr. Glyn Baird received me in his rooms, where the air was dry with neglect and the faint tang of iodine. He poured whiskey at 11:30 with the air of a man doing something medicinal. I didn't comment. Arden was precise, said Baird, morally rigorous. In a way I could never quite stomach. Always seemed to have the right answer, the doctrinal one, the one that glittered in committee reports. His hands trembled slightly as he lit a cigarette. The ulcer or remorse? Possibly neither. He quoted Nietzsche at me, unbidden. He who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster. Then laughed thinly, as though realizing too late the irony. He claimed no quarrel with Arden. No scandal, no falling out. Only the slow corrosion of time between colleagues. And whiskey. Judith Merton's office was 4 staircases and 3 decades removed from Baird's. The scent of bergamot lingered. Her books were arranged not by subject, but by sorrow. Augustine beside Vale, Bonhoeffer beside Donne. She welcomed me with what I've come to recognize as the purest form of disdain, restrained politeness. Felix and I, she said, admired the same saints and hated the same colleagues. That was enough to sustain us once. She did not elaborate, nor did I ask. She looked past me as she spoke, into the courtyard, where the skeletons of ivy clung to the outer stone. Felix was, above all, clear. That's what people respected. No hesitation, no tremor. He knew the truth and never once let love interfere with it. The word love hung in the air like breath on winter glass. She did not say whether it had been returned. Father Constantine Hale, when I finally found him in the college chapel, was lighting a candle with the kind of stillness that seemed borrowed from another century. He greeted me softly, and when I mentioned Felix Arden, he pressed 2 fingers against his lips. Silence first, then speech. Felix was a rare thing, he said. A man who could carry the weight of being right. I always envied him that. Did you quarrel? Number. We disagreed often, but never in anger. He believed in judgment, I in grace. He offered no alibi, no theory, no gossip. Only a half-finished sentence and a prayer that trailed into dust. By then, I had grown tired of reverence, of the way Arden had been canonized by those who had once, I suspect, burned quietly at his coldness. So I asked Lewis to fetch the visitor's register, an old habit of mine, more fruitful than autopsies. The book was kept in the porter's lodge, a leather-bound ledger with ink that faded from era to era. Most of the names were predictable, visiting deans, relatives, former students come to relive disappointment. But one entry paused me. DVL 1917. The plate was precise. Not university issue. The name beside it had been written, then half scratched away. Illegible. The date beside it matched the night before Arden died. I asked the porter, a man who seemed trained to forget faces, if he recalled the visitor. Number said the man was here to meet Doctor. Arden, left before midnight. Quiet sort. I turned the page. But it had been torn. Not cleanly. Not by accident. The ragged edge suggested urgency. Or concealment. Lewis stood beside me. Anything, sir. Only what isn't there, I said. The page. The name. The echo. It was late afternoon when I found her again. The sky, unsure of its allegiance to spring, hung low with a colourless indecision. Rain clung to the edges of the quad, not falling, merely waiting. I stood beneath the lintel of East Hall and watched the students move about with that peculiar mix of self-importance and self-effacement Oxford fosters so well. Imogen Vale sat alone on the window-sill of the cloister corridor, a place just warm enough for thought and just cold enough to keep company away. She was reading something thick and weathered, not from the syllabus. Her lips moved, though no sound escaped. She didn't flinch when I approached, only glanced up with the tired acceptance of someone who expected their solitude to be taken. I asked if she remembered anything more, about the scream, about the night. Number only that it didn't sound like fear. Not exactly. More like someone being woken up too suddenly. I waited. Silence has a way of coaxing honesty. There was one thing, she said. Days before Arden died, during a tutorial, he seemed not ill but distant, distracted maybe, or irritated by something that wouldn't leave him alone. She closed the book on her lap. Devotions upon Emergent Occasions, a worn paperback annotated heavily in green ink. He was talking about dawn, about death, as usual, and he misquoted him. How? She hesitated, then recited, softly, precisely. Never send for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. I looked at her. That's not the line exactly. That's why it stuck. The inversion was slight, barely noticeable, but deliberate. Never send for whom. As if the act of inquiry were the error, not the ignorance. As if the one who asked had already betrayed the answer. Imogen watched me for a moment, and I realized she was gauging something. Not my interest, but my belief. I didn't correct him, she said. I thought maybe he meant to change it. Maybe he did. She looked out past the window. The light on the stone was turning bruised, violet at the edges. He wasn't afraid, she said finally. That was what was strange. It was like he'd already heard the bell and knew it wasn't for him. I left her then. I had no right to take more. Later that evening, back in my flat, I opened a bottle of something red and obscure and poured just enough to remind myself I was not yet done with the day. Lewis arrived without knocking, a habit I'd never encouraged and rarely corrected. He sat across from me, eyeing the pile of notes that had become my carpet. Any joy? I told him about the quote, the misquote, the way Arden, a man allergic to error, had twisted the line. Lewis shrugged, too young for poetry and too sensible for ghosts. Could have been a slip. He doesn't slip, I said. Not like that. Not with Don. So what are you saying? He was sending a message? I drank. The wine was thin, tart, almost ecclesiastical in its self-denial. I think the message wasn't for us. I think it was to himself. A kind of reminder. Or forgiveness. Lewis frowned. You think he knew he was going to die? I looked at him then, the kind of look that has nothing to do with faces. Even the dead can lie, I said, especially when they've been trained to tell the truth. The rain began at last. Quietly, as though it had decided not to be dramatic. Just present. Just steady. Lewis said nothing, and I didn't ask him to stay. The library at St. Simeon's is not grand. It lacks the vaulted majesty of Magdalene's or the warm rot of Bodley's older corners, but what it has is discipline, a quiet, obsessive order that reveals more in its absences than in its holdings. Catalogues here are sacred texts, pages turned with gloved caution, Silence maintained not by rules, but reverence. It was the absence that drew me in. A missing volume, De Ordine, Augustine. Catalogued, shelved by number, cross-referenced, and yet gone. Not borrowed, not lost. Just not there. A thing expected and then not found. That, too, is a kind of crime. The librarian, a pale man with too many cardigans and not enough conversation, confirmed its disappearance with visible discomfort. A week ago, maybe more. Not officially checked out. No name recorded. In Oxford, books go missing for many reasons. Theft, laziness, obsession. But theology books vanish differently. They are not stolen. They are taken, quietly, guiltily, like relics. I followed the absence to the chapel. The building is smaller than one imagines, hunched against the wind like a man in prayer. Inside, the air was cool with stone and beeswax, the scent of centuries. And there, seated beneath the narrow light of a clear-story window, was Father Hale. Reading. He did not hear me approach. I cleared my throat gently. He looked up, not startled, merely returned. I asked about the book. His eyes moved slightly to his left, where the spine lay exposed. De Ordine. Unmistakable. I was using it, he said simply. For reference, I intended to return it. I asked why he hadn't borrowed it properly. He looked away then, not in shame, but something quieter. Embarrassment, perhaps, or memory. I didn't want to explain why. He offered the book. No resistance. No excuse. I thanked him, but said nothing more. Back in my rooms, I opened it. The binding was worn, but honest. Pages thin as communion wafers. I turned carefully until I found it. The dog-ear. The Latin was cramped, but legible. Quod ordinatum, videtur ex peccato nasci potest. Roughly, that which seems ordered may be born of sin, not the sort of line one stumbles across without pausing, not in this college, not in this case. The marginalia was faint, nearly lost in the yellowing edge. But it was there, faded ink, angled with precision, to F.A. with contrition. J.M.I. closed the book. F.A. Felix Arden. J.M. Judith Merton. The inscription was careful, formal, not affectionate, not apologetic, with contrition, a word chosen deliberately. The Latin root, contritus, meaning crushed. Ground down, it implied wrongdoing, not error, not accident, a moral failing, a sin. So what was the sin? The obvious possibilities came first. A romance, sour and unsanctioned. A betrayal, professional or personal. Something said that could not be unsaid. But it was the book that unsettled me. The way the text and the context began to blur. Augustine's argument in that chapter concerns divine order. How even the flawed, the fallen, the unjust may contribute to God's ultimate plan. That evil itself might have a place in the architecture of good. A comforting lie, perhaps, or a warning, depending on the reader. Had Judith been confessing? Had Felix received the book and understood, or refused to? I lit a cigarette and opened the window. The city beyond was misted and colorless. Somewhere below, a bell began its hour. Slow, deliberate, patient. It struck twice. No echo followed. I returned to the inscription. The handwriting, though faint, was unquestionably hers. Slanted rightward, firm at the ascenders. She had written it with care, with purpose. I thought of her silence during our interview. The way she had spoken of Arden, admiring but with a bitterness softened by time. She had called him clear, not kind, not good, just clear, a clarity that left others in shadow. I turned the page. Nothing else marked, nothing further explained. But I felt it then, not certainty, that's a poor tool for this work, but suspicion. heavy and deliberate. Something had passed between them, something she had tried to bury in a book on order, and the order now was beginning to fray. Lewis, despite his fondness for football metaphors and an ongoing suspicion of Latin, has an instinct for details no one else considers. It's a gift he doesn't yet know he has, which makes it all the more valuable. It was he who brought the file to my desk, still warm from the photocopier, its staples slightly skewed. He cleared his throat and said, with the air of a man who suspects he's wandered into something too big to name, that Dr. Arden had been awarded a research grant. Substantial, quietly processed. No formal announcement. No published proposal. I asked what it was for. Lewis shrugged. That's the thing, sir. No one knows. There's no subject listed. Just the amount. 30,000. Paid directly into his personal account 4 months ago. I asked who funded it. The source was a private foundation, the Vale Trust. It meant nothing to Lewis. It meant too much to me. I took the paper from him. The corners had begun to curl. I stared at the foundation name a little too long, and he noticed. Vale, sir. Donald Vale. Once a philosopher of some promise. Once a name whispered in Balliol corridors, with the kind of awe reserved for the tragically intelligent. And then, a scandal. Misconduct, though no one could define it clearly. Something about plagiarism, or betrayal, or both. He vanished shortly after. He had a daughter, Imogen. I didn't speak, not at once. Later that afternoon, Lewis and I found ourselves back in the college archive. The college archivist was out, a stroke or a sabbatical, no one could say. But a temp had left the 1973 photo album open on the desk, as though it had been waiting for us. There it was, the staff photograph. Summer robes. Sunlight flat and unforgiving across the quad. Arden, stern, Merton, unsmiling. Hale, younger, with more hair and less grace. And then, the fourth, unlabeled. The man stood slightly apart. Not shunned, exactly, but aware of his edge. A face still caught between arrogance and hurt. The hairline was further back than it should have been for his age. But the eyes were sharp, curious, appraising, still thinking even as the shutter closed. It was Donald Vale. I was certain. Lewis pointed at the corner of the photo. Someone, not recently, had tried to scratch the emulsion, as if the image had offended. I took the photo to Dr. Calloway, who feigned surprise with the practiced manner of someone who had spent years perfecting the exact shape of plausible deniability. That man, I said, tapping the image. He's not labeled. But it's Donald Vale, isn't it? Calloway studied it, eyes half-lidded. Ah, Vale? Yes, we remember him. But he left long ago, resigned before my time. I'm afraid I know nothing else. Nothing else. The phrase always arrives too quickly to be true. I pressed. Arden received a grant from a trust bearing his name. You must know if he's been in contact. Calloway folded his hands. We have not seen Donald Vale in decades. That is the official position. I left the office with the photo in my coat pocket, its corner creased where I had pressed it too hard. Outside, the rain had begun again, soft and disinterested. Lewis walked beside me without speaking. DVL 1917, the license plate from the register, the name that had been scratched out. The year, perhaps a birth date, perhaps not. But now a trail. Donald Vale had returned, quietly or briefly, or not at all. But his shadow had arrived first, and perhaps Arden had seen it before the rest of us. Perhaps that was why he'd accepted the money. Perhaps that was why he'd died. A ghost with a grudge, a daughter with a scream, and a college with a memory far too convenient. High Table at St. Simeon's is a curious theatre. The food is unremarkable, the wine barely patient, But the ritual, the slow unfurling of silence into conversation, the shared performance of erudition, is preserved with the same tenacity as a medieval rite. I sat between a retired chemist and a linguist who appeared never to have spoken aloud before, each chewing with the solemnity of minor prophets. It was toward the end of the fish course, something pallid, possibly haddock, that I heard it. The phrase was dropped casually, as one might misplace a name or fumble a fork. Moral calculus. 2 words, softly spoken and meant, I think, not for me. I turned slightly. The speaker was Judith Merton, leaning toward Father Hale, who nodded without answering. The rest of the conversation moved past me, light as mist, but the phrase remained. Moral calculus. The idea that right and wrong might be measured. That consequence outweighs confession. Arden's territory. That evening I asked Lewis to bring me anything he could find. Arden's notes, lecture outlines, papers unpublished or otherwise. It was late, and he grumbled, but returned not long after with a small stack. Loose pages, stapled sermons, and the kind of notational sprawl only men confident in their intelligence ever attempt. One lecture in particular caught my eye. Untitled, probably delivered without notes. A phrase in the margin, "The truth is not always the highest form of morality." And then, underlined twice, "Silence may be more moral than confession." It sat there like a dare. Arden had been building to something, not abstractly, not academically, but personally. That much was clear now. His logic had always been that of the surgical ethicist, clean, unsentimental. But here, in the slant of his annotations, there was unease. Something else waited beneath the pages. It was Lewis who found the poem. Almost an afterthought, scribbled on the reverse of a sermon about forgiveness. Greek, classical, not Koine, not meant to be read quickly. He translated it for me slowly, with the hesitant rhythm of a man assembling furniture from an old manual. The foot returns to the stone that split it. The shadow kneels where light once stood. The silence repeats what was once confessed, and blood, once dried, remembers the wound. He looked up. Sounds like something from Euripides. I said nothing. The translation was fair, musical even, but slightly too beautiful. The original Greek carried more bluntness. The word for returns, for instance, could also mean revisits or reclaims. And the stone that split it wasn't merely metaphorical. It implied intention, deliberate pain, not just accident, but consequence. But it was the final line that caught me. Not the blood, the wound, the memory of it. Arden hadn't been writing a poem. He had been writing a map. This was no meditation. It was a record, a marking of place and time and guilt, the scene of a past betrayal, not ancient, not theoretical, something lived, recent, and he had hidden it, folded it into the margin of his faith, scribbled it where only someone curious or intrusive might find it. I sat back, letting the pages fall across my knees. The wind outside had picked up. A shutter clattered once, like a question knocking twice. I thought again of Merton's voice at high table. Moral calculus. A cold phrase. But not without purpose. Arden had believed once in confession, but near the end, he had turned to silence. Not because it was easier, but because it cost more. Some betrayals do not ask for apology. They ask only to be remembered. And some memories, like poems, return again and again to the place they first cut. It was past midnight when the call came. Lewis's voice was steadier than mine might have been. There's been another incident at St. Simeon's. The Vale girl, East Hall. She's alive, but not quite herself. By the time I arrived, the sky was beginning its slow surrender to dawn. Not light, but its memory. A suggestion of shape where shadow used to be. Imogen Vale was sitting at the foot of the East Hall stairwell, knees drawn in, hair damp against her temple. Her hands trembled, not violently, but rhythmically, like the slowing tick of a faulty clock. She didn't speak immediately, just looked up at me and said, "He was standing where Arden died." Not a ghost. He looked at me like I was someone else. The corridor was empty, the common room sealed. Nothing broken, no scream heard this time, but the silence was louder for it. Later, in the porter's lodge, Lewis showed me the sign-in sheet. Blank. No visitors after dusk, but the college had always operated on the assumption of honesty, a foolish expectation in a place trained to outwit itself. We drove to Cowley that morning, a row of terraced houses, all brick and condensation, the kind of address that leaves no forwarding trace. He opened the door himself, thinner than the photograph. Hair gone to ash, hands too large for his sleeves, the sort of man whose presence required apology. "You're Inspector Morse," he said. "It's about Arden, then." I asked if we might come in. He didn't move, but the door widened. A tacit yes. He offered no coffee. No chair. He stood in the middle of the living room like an object mislaid. A chair left in a hallway, a book shelved upside down. I went to St. Simeon's that night. I admit that. I hadn't seen Felix in 20 years. But I didn't kill him. The words were unprompted. His eyes flicked past me, to a window he'd probably forgotten how to close. "He stole something from me," he said, softer now, not money, not ideas, a future. He turned slightly, gesturing toward a shelf with no books, only dust and a single photograph, face down. "Judith and I, we had plans, but Felix had a way of making ethics sound like love, and love like obligation. When they offered him the lectureship, he told them I wasn't ready, said I was erratic, undisciplined." His voice cracked, not with emotion, but fatigue. He said it kindly, of course. That was his gift, to wound without ever raising his voice. Lewis asked what he'd said when he found Arden. Vale shrugged, a broken shrug. Nothing in the end. He looked at me, said my name. I couldn't say anything back, I just left. I thought, maybe that was enough punishment, that he saw what I'd become. I believed him. Not because the story was perfect, but because it wasn't. Because no man recounts a lie so plainly, so pitifully. Outside, the rain began again, half-hearted, indecisive. Lewis looked at me as we walked to the car. If he didn't do it, why return now? Why scare the girl? I shook my head. He didn't mean to be seen. Guilt is a kind of haunting. He came back to the scene because some part of him never left. I didn't say it aloud, but I remembered the Greek poem. The foot returns to the stone that split it. Some returns are not acts of will. They're inevitabilities. Back at the college, I stood again in the East Hall stairwell. Same flickering bulb. Same hairline crack on the third riser. I looked toward the space where Arden had fallen, and for a moment, no more than a breath, I thought I saw another shape there. Not a man, not a ghost, just the outline of a decision, half made, half regretted. Never quite gone. The torn page had sat beside me for days, folded once, then again. I turned it over between fingers, read it from angles, sniffed the faint ghost of ink. But it wasn't until I held it to the lamplight, the pale halo of a winter's 4 a.m., that I saw what had eluded me. The tear was precise. Not hurried, not accidental. A single, purposeful motion. From the corner, straight through the name that ought to have followed DVL 1917. A removal, not a mistake. And the paper beneath still bore the faint signature of something once written, once real, now peeled away. It was, I thought, the kind of erasure only a scholar might trust, that the absence would go unnoticed because the form had been preserved. But form, I've learned, is often the first to betray us. I walked to the chapel not long after, coat unbuttoned, my left shoe still damp from the quad. The silence inside was thick. Pulpit, lectern, nave, all composed into stillness, save for the flickering of one votive, left to die slowly. I sat where I knew Arden had often sat, third pew from the back, east aisle. He preferred the distance, I'd been told, said it kept things in perspective. I closed my eyes and listened, not for sound, but for rhythm, the order of things. Imogen's voice returned to me, half-whispered, memory-laced. He said, "The bell tolls for thee," but wrong somehow, as if he didn't believe it. Misquotation is a curious thing. A misstep, yes, but often deliberate. A misquotation can mask more than truth. It can reveal intention. Don's line, properly rendered, speaks not to death, but to belonging. Never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee, not for the dead, for the living, for the hearer. Arden had inverted it, and that inversion had been his confession. Because he wasn't mourning, he was indicting. Somewhere behind me, the chapel floor creaked. Old wood, old guilt. I turned slowly, but no one was there. The Augustine was still where I'd left it, on Hale's desk. Deordin, that particular copy, annotated, worn at the spine. The inscription was faint, as if written under breath, to F.A., with contrition. J.M. I'd assumed, as most would, that Judith Merton had penned it. Their rivalry, their affection, their long-winded, Latin-laced disagreements, but it never sat right. Too formal, too pointed. It was Lewis, oddly, who gave me the key. Or rather, the memory of something he said in passing. That bit you translated in the chapel, sir, Justitia Mortua. Sounds like a motto for lawyers, not priests. Justice is dead. Not a name, then. Not Judith Merton, Justitia Mortua. The phrase that governed the inscription also governed the crime. Not personal regret, but philosophical finality. Arden had built his life on moral calculus, and now someone had decided the sum no longer held. The murderer hadn't acted from hatred or revenge, not even anger. They'd acted out of belief that justice, long dead, must be buried properly, and only one person, quiet, elusive, and cloaked in mercy, had both the reason and the access. Father Hale. He had watched from the edges, offered no contradiction, maintained Arden's sainthood and eulogy while knowing precisely what had been taken and from whom. I stood again in the chapel. The candle had gone out, the last of its warmth still curled in the wax. Hale, I knew, would not confess. He had done so already. In the margins, in the silences, in the line of scripture chosen for Arden's funeral, he shall have judgment without mercy that hath showed no mercy. I whispered the line once more to myself, not as accusation, as epitaph. Some elegies are never lost, just misplaced and found again where the bell tolls. She opened the door before I knocked. That quiet precision again. Judith Merton had always been a woman of timings, of silences arrived at by design. Her rooms were warm, the only ones in college that ever smelled faintly of lavender, I'd noticed, though the window was ajar and the Oxford dusk hung in the air like breath withheld. She said nothing at first, merely turned and walked back to the decanter on the bureau, lifting 2 glasses, setting one down, mine, without looking. I didn't touch it. She did. "You've seen the inscription," she said. Her voice was neither resigned nor defiant, just factual, like someone stating the time. I nodded. "Then you know." There are degrees of confession. This one required no more than presence. I sat. She remained standing. It was never simple, she said, though I suppose that's how these stories always end. Someone hurt. Someone silent. A line crossed that no one saw until it became a cliff. Donald and I were not young, but younger. Before Imogen, before the committees and the journals, and all the things that pretend to matter, Arden found out, and instead of outing us, as was his right, as he'd often claimed truth was paramount, he chose something worse. He took Donald's thesis, the real one, the dangerous one, the one about ethics in decline, and published it under his own name with enough alterations to make the theft legal, if not moral. And when the questions came, as they always do, he let Donald fall, whispered that it was all a hoax, a trick played by a second-rate mind. He was a man of principle, yes. But they were his principles, and we, Donald and I, had become inconvenient to them. She sipped, then set the glass down beside mine, untouched. I found the letters, she said. 2 weeks before he died. He'd kept them, Donald's, mine, even the old photographs. Proof not of affection, but of possession. I confronted him. He said we'd been a youthful error in his ledger. I asked her if she'd planned it. No, she said. That's the most honest part of this. I hadn't planned anything. I'd gone to his rooms that evening only to plead, for Imogen's sake, not ours. He offered me tea. Jasmine. Said I looked tired. Said the years had made me bitter. And somewhere in the conversation, I don't remember where exactly, I saw the small bottle by his desk, the one he used when the ulcer flared. I poured the tea, a little more than was needed, stirred, let the bitterness fold in. He reached for the cup, then hesitated. Said something about Don, oddly, that death, real death, was not absence but an echo that never returned. Then he collapsed. I could have called someone. I could have screamed. There were 10 people within hearing. But I didn't. She looked at me. Then, really looked. No plea in her eyes. No guilt either. You'll do what you must, she said. And I did. The walk from her rooms to the lodge was short, but cold. The wind had picked up again, scraping the stone like an old brush. Lewis was waiting beneath the arch. I nodded. No words passed. He knew. Merton followed without resistance. Her coat was buttoned wrong, one off, and I noticed she didn't fix it. We crossed the quad as the bell began its slow toll, the same one that had rung for Arden, for Vale, for all the sins Oxford could not quite erase. No one looked up, and I thought briefly of the crossword waiting in my room, half solved. Half lied too. The clue I hadn't cracked still lingered. To forgive or to forget. 5. I wondered if the answer had ever mattered. The partita was older than the record sleeve suggested. Scratches like the voice of wind across gravel, notes buried in their own echo. Bach but blurred, like a memory replayed one too many times. I let it play. There was no hurry now. The crossword lay almost complete beside me, a mess of penciled doubts and half-answers. One clue left, a sound that means something but tells nothing. 6. I stared at it for a long time, pen poised. There were obvious tricks, puns, homonyms, the usual misdirections, but it was simpler than that. Brutally so. Silence. I wrote it in. Each letter strangely heavy, as if it pressed backward into the page, trying to disappear. The wine had been opened 2 days too long, but I poured it anyway. A full glass. The kind poured not for flavor, but for company. Outside, a faint bell rang. Not the cathedral this time, but one of the parish churches. Distant, apologetic. A single toll. Then quiet. I looked across the room, at the chair that had once belonged to a woman I used to love. She hadn't sat in it for years, but I still thought of it as hers. She liked to cross her legs at the ankle. Said it was a discipline. I'd never mastered it. The chair, of course, remained empty. Like the East Hall, like the chapel after Hale had left. Like the final paragraph of Arden's last manuscript, which trailed off mid-sentence as if truth had simply walked away. Lewis had called. Twice. I'd seen his name flicker across the receiver, but I couldn't speak. Not yet. Not when the words felt like rust in the throat. He'd understand. Or pretend to. The arrest had been quiet. Merton hadn't wept, hadn't pleaded. She had turned once as they led her through the quad and looked up at the sky. Not at me, not at anyone. Just the sky. A gesture so private I almost turned away. I think it was the calm that unnerved me most, as though all the shouting had already happened, years ago, in some echo chamber of unread letters and unsaid apologies. Vale was gone again. Back into whatever borrowed life he'd stitched for himself in Cowley. A philosopher without a forum, a father without a face. Imogen hadn't asked about him since the collapse. Perhaps she wouldn't. Some truths, when returned, are more burden than gift. And Arden, Felix, the great ethicist, the sculptor of moral absolutes, lay now in ground too shallow for myth. His clarity had been a kind of violence, but it had shone, however falsely. That was the cruelty. I sipped the wine. It had turned slightly, like fruit left too long on the branch. The record skipped, caught on a single note like a stuttered breath. I didn't rise to fix it. Some mistakes, I've found, become beautiful only when repeated. Silence. It's a sound. I know that now. It has tone, texture. You can almost measure it, the way you can weigh grief without speaking of loss, the way an empty hallway holds more memory than the rooms it connects. That's where we'd found him. Arden. Hand outstretched, palm open, as if reaching for something just out of frame. Not help. Not regret. Just some final syllable he never managed to speak. I often think about that position. The way the fingers curled slightly inward, not in pain, but in offering. Perhaps he thought someone might still be listening. The partita stopped. I let the armchair remain empty. I always do.